Transformation never happens in a day. And yet, if you don't do the right things today, you will not be able to transform who you want to be in a week, a month, or years from now. What I've been wrestling with this morning is the relationship between short-term and long-term choices. A lot of the times, we focus on short-term choices that will release the greatest amount of stress or pain in the present. But sometimes we're sacrificing the long-term benefits because of our short-term pleasure. Right now, this is super abstract, so let me pull it down into something a little more tangible. In Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, this is the context where he's actually giving warnings against, really in the context of financial warnings. Warnings against being slothful or being lazy, and how that impacts ultimately the security that sometimes material things can provide. Now again, this is not health and wealth. This is Solomon wrestling with short-term versus long-term choices and how it impacts things like finances. Chapter 6, verse 6 says this: "Go to the ant, you sluggard." That imagery is so powerful. He's talking to a person that is lazy. And if there's one thing an ant can be accused of, it is not laziness. I mean, think about an ant. You know, in some of my weak moments, especially when I was younger, I loved going over to ant piles and kicking them over. I know, sadistic. There are all kinds of weird, maybe strange, counseling issues. I get it. But one of the things I always found fascinating is whenever you kicked over an anthill, they didn't pause with this, "Oh, come on." They didn't have a moment to complain. They didn't have a gathering party where you're just trying to see if everybody else's misery is less than yours. And so you're telling where you were whenever the foot came down. No. What ants do is they immediately start rebuilding it. Ants can be accused of a lot of things, but being lazy, that's not one of them. He says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard," because apparently there's something there we can learn. Consider its ways and be wise. So what are the ways that it focuses on? Verse 7, "It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores up its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest." In other words, he says, you don't need to have some tyrannical ruler that says, "Now go do this, now go do that." No, he says, stop and pay attention to the wise ways of the ants. They do not waste opportunities to work on things that they know are not just valuable, but will help them survive, will help them stay alive, will help them thrive. They store up its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. Why? Because there's coming a time in the future where they will not be able to store up their food, where they will have to have done enough work so that fruit can be born in the long term. Here's why I find this so compelling of a proverb that applies not just to finances, but to transformation as a whole. I tell my students this all the time, and I've even been talking to my children about this most recently, or a lot recently. As I tell them, I say, listen, the decisions about who you want to be in 10 years, the decisions that craft that identity, that fruit, they begin with the choices you make today. And the choices can seem small. And yet the small choices, like the ant, prepare us for the long-term goals that we actually have. If drawing closer to Jesus is your goal, then it's the short-term decisions that you make that will ultimately bear that long-term fruit or folly. Like right now, if you are not taking time to just sit down with the Lord, to listen to his presence, to pray with him, to read his word, to even like this, gather some sort of devotionally stimulating material so that you can listen to it or you can read it and it can then mull around in your brain for the rest of the day. I know they seem like small decisions. 5 minutes here, 7 minutes here, 9 minutes here. And yet those small decisions are like ants storing up food in the summer. Because when the time comes, when you stop and you do the glorious thing of reflecting back, you will be able to see that each of those small decisions were made in the short term, but have had massive long-term impact. Here's my challenge for you this week. Wrestle with the decisions you're making in the short term. And are they primarily centered on keeping you away from more pain or avoiding whatever types of stress? Or are your short-term decisions always made with an eye to the long term of who you know God's calling you to be? Of the life that God is calling you to live, not one that just survives, but one in which you are thriving, pressing deeper into him. And once you make an assessment of those choices, this is what I would challenge you to do. Make a plan in the short term for how the short-term decisions are going to over time pile up so that long-term you can look more and more like the ant who looks more and more like the God who created him in the beginning. I love you guys. Have a good week.